My 9-year-old grandson stood on my porch in the pouring rain. He was bleeding and barefoot. He was clutching a shattered cell phone like it was his only lifeline. When he looked up at me with eyes completely hollowed out by terror and begged me not to let his own parents take him back, I knew I was looking at pure evil. I sacrificed my life savings to protect that boy. But to save him, I had to play a dangerous game against my own flesh and blood and call 911 before they could erase the horrifying truth forever. My name is Hank Harrison. I am 71 years old. For 40 long years, I made my living as a heavy-duty diesel mechanic. I spent my days pulling wrenches on massive 18-wheelers and breathing in thick exhaust fumes so I could provide a good life for my family. My hands are permanently stained with engine grease, and severe arthritis has settled deep into my joints. But I have always been a man who believed in hard and honest work. I live in a quiet and modest suburb just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is the kind of neighborhood where people mind their own business and keep their porch lights on for one another. But the quiet peace of my retirement was shattered into a million pieces on a torrential Tuesday night. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets. It was hammering against the roof of my house like a relentless barrage of stones. Thunder shook the wooden floorboards beneath my feet, and lightning flashed so brightly it turned the night sky a sickly shade of purple. I was sitting in my worn-out leather recliner. I was nursing a hot cup of black coffee and listening to the wild storm rattle the glass window panes. Then I heard it. Over the deafening roar of the heavy rain, there was a sound that made my blood run instantly cold. It was a frantic and desperate pounding on my heavy oak front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a rapid, panicked hammering like someone was fighting for their very life. I set my coffee mug down so fast that the dark liquid spilled all across the side table. My bad knees ached fiercely as I pushed myself out of the chair, but the sheer terror in that knocking pushed me forward. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and yanked the door open, expecting to see a stranded motorist or a neighbor in desperate trouble. Instead, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Standing there on my welcome mat, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was my 9-year-old grandson Leo. The freezing wind was whipping the rain sideways and soaking my hallway carpet, but I could not move. I just stared at this tiny and fragile boy. He was not wearing a winter jacket. He was not even wearing shoes. His small, pale feet were muddy and scraped red from running on the rough, wet asphalt. His thin cotton pajamas were plastered to his bony frame, and his dirty blonde hair was matted flat to his forehead. But the thing that made my heart stop beating was the blood. There was a fresh, angry gash right above his left eyebrow. A thin stream of bright crimson was washing down his pale cheek, mixing with the freezing rain. His thin chest was heaving up and down as he gasped for air. His teeth chattered so loudly I could hear the sound over the booming thunder. In his small, trembling hands, he was clutching an old, cracked smartphone. He held the device tight against his chest, like it was the most precious thing in the entire world. I fell to my knees right there on the wet hardwood floor, completely ignoring the sharp, burning pain in my aging joints. I reached out and grabbed his freezing shoulders. I pulled him inside into the warmth of the hallway. "Leo, my God, what happened to you?" I asked. My voice was rough and thick with panic. I tried to lift him up into my arms, but he pushed his frail body hard against my chest. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the device, but he shoved the cracked phone directly into my calloused hands. His fingers were as cold as ice. "Grandpa," he whispered. His voice was breaking into a terrified and breathless sob. "Grandpa, they are coming. Please do not let them take me back. Please, Grandpa, do not let them find me." The raw, absolute horror in his young voice felt like a physical blow to my chest. This was not the normal fear of a child who had a bad dream or got into minor trouble at school. This was the primal animal terror of a boy running for his very survival. I wrapped my thick arms around him to shield his shivering body from the cold air rushing through the door. "Who is coming?" "Leo," I asked. I was trying desperately to keep my own rising panic in check. "Who did this to you?" Before he could utter another word, the terrible answer arrived. Through the open doorway, I saw two blinding white headlights cut violently through the dark sheets of rain. A sleek, black luxury SUV tore up my long gravel driveway. It was spinning its tires and throwing thick mud everywhere before slamming on the brakes right in front of my porch steps. I recognized that expensive vehicle instantly. It belonged to my son Bradley and his wife Chloe. Leo let out a sound that I can only describe as a whimper of pure agony. He scrambled backward, slipping slightly on the wet floor. He ran and tried to hide his tiny body behind the large wooden kitchen island. Seeing the absolute panic in my grandson's eyes triggered a protective rage deep inside my soul that I did not even know I possessed. I grabbed the heavy front door and slammed it shut. I threw the metal deadbolt and locked it tight. I grabbed my cell phone from the kitchen counter. I pushed Leo further into the dark shadows behind the oak cabinets, and I immediately dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher picked up right away, asking for my location. As I quickly whispered my address into the receiver, the violent pounding started on my front door. It was Bradley. I could hear his heavy boots stomping on the wood porch. He was slamming his fists against the door and screaming my name. He was demanding that I open up immediately because his sick son was having a dangerous manic episode and needed help. I looked down at the shattered phone in my hand. I did not know what secrets it held yet, but I knew it was the exact reason my grandson had run barefoot through a freezing storm. The rain continued to batter the roof, matching the rapid and furious beating of my heart. Bradley shouted again, his voice twisting into a fake tone of parental concern that made my empty stomach turn. I told the dispatcher to send police officers immediately because there was a hostile threat outside my home. I hung up the phone and looked over the counter at Leo. He was hugging his knees to his chest, trembling helplessly in the dark shadows. I stood firmly between that locked door and my terrified grandson. I tightly gripped the cracked phone Leo had given me. I listened to my own son yelling his wicked lies through the storm. I knew right then and there that I was going to tear my son's entire world apart to keep this innocent boy safe. Before I could even reach out to grab a dry towel from the hallway rack, Leo collapsed forward right into my chest. His small body was hyperventilating so violently that his ribcage heaved against me like a trapped bird. The freezing rain dripped from his matted blonde hair onto my flannel shirt. I wrapped my thick, heavy arms around him, trying to share whatever body heat I had left in my old bones. He felt so unbelievably fragile. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and his breathing came in sharp, ragged gasps. He pressed his face into my shoulder, and I could feel the hot tears mixing with the cold rainwater on his cheeks. "Grandpa, they are coming," he whispered. His voice was completely broken and raspy, like he had been screaming for hours. "Do not let them take me back. Please, Grandpa. They are going to hurt me." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. The absolute primal terror in his gaze is something I will never forget for as long as I live. This was not a child trying to get out of being grounded. This was a boy who believed he was fighting for his life. With hands shaking so badly he could barely manage it, he shoved that old cracked smartphone directly into my calloused palms. I gripped the device tightly. It felt unnaturally heavy in my hands, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 dark secrets. Just as my fingers closed around the shattered glass of the screen, A blinding beam of light slashed through my front window. I looked up and saw a sleek black SUV tearing up my long gravel driveway. The vehicle was moving way too fast for the torrential rain. It fishtailed slightly in the thick mud before slamming to a sudden aggressive halt right at the edge of my front lawn. The engine roared loudly over the rolling thunder. I did not need to see the license plate to know exactly who was behind the wheel. It was my own flesh and blood. It was my son Bradley and his wife Chloe. Seeing that expensive vehicle sitting in the rain like a predator waiting to pounce triggered something deep and explosive inside my chest. I recognized the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from my grandson, and in that split second, I made my choice. I did not hesitate. I shoved my full body weight against the heavy oak front door and slammed it shut with a deafening thud. I twisted the solid brass deadbolt, locking it firmly into place. I grabbed the heavy iron chain lock and secured it right as I heard the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut outside. I grabbed Leo gently by the shoulders and quickly ushered him into the kitchen. I pushed his small, shivering frame down behind the massive, solid wood kitchen island. "Stay right here, and do not make a single sound," I ordered him, in a low, urgent whisper. I grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the back of a dining chair and threw it over his trembling shoulders. Leo curled himself into a tiny ball, pulling the warm blanket over his head entirely. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and immediately dialed 911. My thumb was shaking, but my mind was crystal clear. The emergency dispatcher picked up on the second ring. 911. "What is your emergency?" she asked in a calm and steady voice. "I need police officers at my house right now," I said, keeping my voice as low and steady as I possibly could. "My address is 42 Maple Drive. There is a hostile situation escalating on my front porch. My 9-year-old grandson ran to my house barefoot in a severe thunderstorm, fleeing from his parents. They just pulled up outside and they are trying to force their way in." The dispatcher started asking standard questions, but her voice was quickly drowned out by a massive, deafening boom. Bradley had reached the porch and was slamming both of his heavy fists against the thick wood of my front door. "Dad, open the door right now!" Bradley screamed from the other side. His voice was muffled by the howling wind and the heavy rain, but the absolute fury in his tone cut right through the solid wood. "Open this damn door, Dad. We know Leo is in there." "Are they attempting to break in?" the dispatcher asked, her tone shifting into high alert. "They are pounding on the door demanding entry," I replied, watching the brass doorknob rattle aggressively as Bradley tried to force it open. "I am not letting them inside. My grandson is terrified. Just get the squad cars here now before they break a window." I hung up the phone and slipped the cracked device Leo had given me deep into the front pocket of my denim work jeans. I took a deep breath, bracing my aging body, and walked back into the front hallway. "Dad, listen to me," Bradley yelled again. The doorknob twisted and shook violently. "You do not understand what is going on. Leo is having a severe manic episode. He is completely out of his mind. He ran out of the house during a fever dream. He is sick, Dad. You know he is sick. He needs his medication right now, or he is going to have a seizure." The sheer manipulation in his voice made my empty stomach physically churn. He sounded so incredibly convincing. If I did not have the context of my grandson showing up battered and pleading for his life, I might have actually believed the concerned father act. Bradley was a wealthy investment broker. He knew exactly how to pitch a story. He knew how to sound perfectly reasonable while pushing complete lies. Then I heard Chloe crying. Her voice drifted through the storm, high-pitched and laced with artificial panic. "Please, Hank," she sobbed loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Please open the door. My baby boy is having a psychological break. We just want to get him to the hospital. He is a danger to himself, Hank. Please let us help our little boy." I stood silently in the dark hallway, just a few inches away from the locked door. I did not say a single word back to them. I knew that engaging in a screaming match would give them ammunition to use against me later. I just listened to the sick, twisted performance they were putting on. They were laying the groundwork for their defense. They were already painting Leo as crazy and unstable in case anyone else was listening. But the boy hiding behind my kitchen island was not having a manic episode. He was not delusional. He was a smart, quiet kid who had run for his life. The heavy rain continued to wash over the roof as Bradley kicked the bottom of the door with his heavy leather boot. "I am warning you, Dad," Bradley roared, dropping the concerned parent facade for just a fraction of a second. His voice dropped into a dark, threatening growl. "If you do not unlock this door, I will call the police myself and tell them you kidnapped him. You are acting crazy. Do not do this." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. I looked back toward the kitchen where the edge of the wool blanket was barely visible behind the island. I felt the cold, cracked screen of the cell phone pressing against my leg inside my pocket. I knew whatever was on that device held the truth they were so desperately trying to bury. I tightened my fists and stood my ground, waiting for the flashing red and blue lights to cut through the storm. The red and blue strobe lights finally cut through the heavy sheets of falling rain. The loud, wailing siren of a police cruiser echoed down the quiet street, coming to a sudden halt, right behind the expensive luxury vehicle sitting in my driveway. I felt a tiny fraction of relief wash over my tired, aging bones. I truly thought the authorities would see through the madness. I thought they would look at a terrified, bleeding 9-year-old boy and immediately know that something was horribly wrong in that household. But I had severely underestimated the wicked cunning of my own flesh and blood. I instructed my grandson to stay perfectly still behind the heavy wooden kitchen island. I kept the warm wool blanket draped tightly over his shivering shoulders. I walked to the front hallway, unlocked the brass deadbolt, and pulled the heavy oak door open just as 2 uniformed officers stepped onto my wet porch. The rain was still coming down in thick buckets, soaking their dark blue uniforms. Before I could even open my mouth to explain the horrific physical state my grandson was in, Bradley and Chloe launched into a theatrical performance that made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. The aggressive, violent man who had just been kicking my door with heavy boots completely vanished. In his place stood Bradley, the polished, wealthy investment broker. He immediately raised his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender and stepped back to give the police officers plenty of space. Chloe was even worse. She threw herself toward the younger officer. Her face was buried in her hands, and she was sobbing with the kind of heart-wrenching gasps that only a truly desperate mother could produce. This was the same woman who directed the choir at the largest community church in our suburb. She knew exactly how to captivate an audience and play to their sympathies. "Oh, thank God you are here," Officer Chloe cried out. Her voice was trembling with artificial panic. "Please help us. It is our little boy Leo. He is very sick. He is so incredibly sick, and we are terrified he is going to hurt himself in the dark." The taller of the 2 officers put a comforting hand on her shoulder. He asked them to calm down and explain the situation clearly. Bradley stepped forward, wiping a fake bead of sweat from his forehead. He spoke with the articulate, measured tone of a man who managed $1-million portfolios for a living. He looked the officer directly in the eye and delivered a lie so smooth it made my stomach physically churn. "Officer, my son suffers from severe psychological delusions and a rare degenerative nerve condition," Bradley said. "His brain chemistry is highly unstable right now. Tonight his fever spiked rapidly and he suffered a massive psychotic break. He was hallucinating badly. He thought we were trying to hurt him." Chloe nodded frantically, burying her face into her husband's expensive wool coat. She told the police that during this supposed fever dream, Leo had become completely irrational and violent. She claimed he had ransacked her bedside drawer, stolen her old cell phone, and bolted out the back door into the freezing storm before they could physically stop him. She wept openly, begging the police not to be harsh with him. She told them he was just a confused, sick little boy who desperately needed his specialized medication to prevent a fatal seizure. I stood in the doorway, gripping the wooden frame so hard my arthritic knuckles turned entirely white. I tried to interject and defend my grandson. I told the officers that Leo was hiding in my kitchen because he was terrified for his life. I told them he was bleeding and begging me to protect him from his own parents. But as I spoke, I saw the exact moment the officers stopped listening to me. I saw their eyes drift from my greasy work boots and my faded flannel shirt over to my son's tailored clothing and my daughter-in-law's perfectly manicured appearance. One of the officers even recognized Chloe from the local Sunday church services. That was the final nail in the coffin. They looked at me not as a concerned grandfather, but as a confused, overreacting old man who simply did not understand the complexities of modern medical science. The older officer sighed and gave me a look of deep, patronizing pity. It was the exact kind of look you give to a senile relative who has lost their grip on reality. "Mr. Harrison," the officer said softly, using a tone reserved for soothing, frightened toddlers, "we know this is very stressful for you. It is incredibly hard to see a child acting out of sorts. But your son and daughter-in-law are just trying to get the boy his necessary medical treatment. You need to step aside and let them care for their sick child." The sheer injustice of it all burned my throat like battery acid. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to grab Bradley by the collar of his expensive coat and drag him out into the freezing rain. I wanted to pull the cracked cell phone out of my pocket and demand they investigate the monster standing on my porch. But I knew better. I had spent 40 years working in harsh diesel shops, and I knew that if you force a jammed gear, you will end up breaking the entire engine. If I lost my temper right then and there, I would play directly into their twisted narrative. The police would view me as a hostile and uncooperative threat. They would slap heavy metal handcuffs on my wrists, drag me to the police station, and leave Leo completely defenseless in the hands of the very people who were destroying him. I had to swallow my righteous anger. I had to let them think they had won this round so I could keep myself out of a jail cell and figure out how to slowly tear their perfect lies apart. As I stood there in my narrow hallway watching the police officers swallow every single lie, my son and daughter-in-law were spinning. Another set of bright headlights slashed through the heavy rain. A sleek silver sports car pulled up right behind the patrol cruiser. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Trent. Trent was Chloe's older brother. He was a slick, fast-talking local real estate lawyer who always wore expensive tailored suits and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He walked up my muddy driveway, holding a large golf umbrella over his head, looking completely out of place on my modest wooden porch. I knew right then that the situation was about to go from bad to an absolute nightmare. Trent did not come here out of concern for his nephew. He came here to control the narrative and protect their money. Trent immediately took charge of the scene. He shook hands with the officers, introducing himself with his full title and handing out his glossy business cards right there in the pouring rain. He spoke with that smooth, arrogant confidence of a man who was used to bullying working-class people into submission. He told the officers that he legally represented the family and that they were dealing with a highly sensitive medical emergency. He threw around heavy legal jargon talking about medical conservatorships, psychiatric holds, and custodial rights. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my chest and told the police that I was willfully obstructing the emergency medical care of a severely disabled minor. He claimed that every second Leo was kept away from his vital medication, the boy was moving closer to a fatal neurological collapse. The officers completely bought it. They were young and clearly intimidated by Trent's aggressive legal posturing. The taller officer turned to me and sternly ordered me to step aside and release the boy to his legal guardians immediately. He placed his hand firmly on his radio belt, telling me that if I refused, he would have no choice but to place me under arrest for child endangerment and obstruction of justice. I looked at the two armed police officers standing on my porch. I looked at Bradley, who was hiding a wicked smirk behind his fake tears. I looked at Trent, who was tapping his expensive watch, as if my grandson's life was just another billable hour. I was completely surrounded. I was legally outgunned and physically outnumbered. My mind raced through the terrible options. If I threw a punch, if I fought them right now, I would undoubtedly end up in the back of that squad car, wearing heavy metal handcuffs. I would be locked away in a holding cell while Bradley and Chloe dragged Leo back to their massive house. I could not protect my grandson from behind iron bars. I needed to live to fight another day. More importantly, I needed to protect the evidence. I could feel the cold, hard shape of that cracked cell phone burning a hole in my denim jeans pocket. I knew Trent would demand to search me or the house for it if Chloe had realized it was missing. I had to secure it immediately. So I did the only thing an old retired mechanic could do. I played the part of the weak, failing old man they wanted me to be. I suddenly clutched the center of my chest with my left hand and let out a sharp, ragged gasp. I staggered backward, letting my knees buckle just enough to hit the hallway wall. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to breathe in short, shallow bursts, acting like my heart was failing me. The distraction worked instantly. The officers rushed forward to catch me, shouting to see if I was having a heart attack. Chloe screamed in fake panic. In that chaotic fraction of a second, while 4 pairs of eyes were focused on my face and my left hand, I dropped my right hand down. With one swift, practiced motion, I slid that shattered smartphone out of my pocket and dropped it straight down into the deep shaft of my heavy leather work boot. It slid perfectly past my ankle and settled securely against the thick rubber sole. By the time the officer grabbed my shoulders to steady me, the phone was completely hidden. I waved them off, pretending to catch my breath. I muttered that it was just a severe angina pain from the stress. I told them I did not need an ambulance. I told them I was just a tired old man who did not want any trouble. Trent sneered and told the police to go get the boy. I was forced to step aside. I had to stand there with my back pressed against the wall and watch as Bradley and the officers pushed past me into my kitchen. They found Leo shivering behind the island. My grandson screamed when Bradley grabbed his tiny arm. He kicked and thrashed, begging for me. "Grandpa, please," he cried out, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Grandpa, you promised you would not let them take me." The sound of his pleading tore my heart into jagged, bleeding pieces. I had to bite my tongue so hard I tasted copper just to keep myself from swinging my heavy fists. I watched them drag my sobbing, helpless grandson out the front door and into the freezing storm. They shoved him into the back of their luxury SUV. The doors slammed shut, cutting off his cries. The police officers gave me one last warning look before walking back to their cruiser. Trent gave me a sickening, triumphant smile before sliding into his silver sports car. I stood alone on my porch as the vehicles pulled away. The freezing rain lashed against my face, washing away my tears. I felt the sharp edge of that cracked phone digging into my ankle inside my boot. I watched their red taillights disappear into the dark storm. I did not yell. I did not cry out. Instead, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to God, right there in the pouring rain. They thought they had beaten a helpless old man, but they had just started a war with a mechanic who knew exactly how to dismantle a machine piece by piece until absolutely nothing was left. The moment the red taillights of my son's luxury vehicle disappeared into the raging storm, I locked the deadbolt and sank back against the solid oak door. My chest was heaving. The adrenaline that had kept me standing was slowly bleeding out of my system, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I limped into the kitchen, leaving a trail of muddy rainwater on the hardwood floor. I sat down heavily on a wooden stool and reached down to unlace my soaked leather work boot. My arthritic fingers fumbled with the wet laces, but I finally managed to pull the heavy boot off. I reached deep inside past the damp wool sock and pulled out the shattered smartphone Leo had shoved into my hands. It was cold to the touch. The spiderweb cracks across the glass screen felt like jagged little razor blades against my thumb. I grabbed a clean cotton shop rag from the counter and began to carefully dab the moisture away from the device. I treated it like a piece of fragile evidence. As I wiped the rainwater off the black plastic casing, my mind started to spin back through the years. I looked down at my hands. They were thick, calloused, and permanently stained with dark engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever wash away. For 40 long years, I woke up before the sun. I dragged myself into a drafty, unheated garage and spent 14 hours a day pulling heavy steel wrenches on massive 18-wheeler trucks. I breathed in thick, toxic diesel fumes and destroyed my lower back for one single reason. I wanted my son Bradley to have a better life than I did. I paid every single penny of his tuition at an elite Ivy League business school, so he would never have to break his back for a paycheck. I thought I was building a legacy of success. I thought I was raising a good man. The bitter irony tasted like ash in my mouth. Everything changed 5 years ago when my beloved wife Shirley was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. Shirley was the absolute light of my life. She was the one who held our family together with a gentle but iron grip. Watching the disease slowly take her away from me broke me into a million unrecognizable pieces. I spent my days sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs and my nights praying to a God I hoped was listening. When Shirley finally passed away, I was left completely hollowed out. But Shirley was a brilliant and meticulous woman. Before the cancer took her, she spent weeks working with estate lawyers to ensure we would all be taken care of. She left behind a very substantial life insurance payout. More importantly, she established a highly specialized medical trust fund, specifically for our only grandson, Leo. She loved that little boy more than anything in the world. She wanted to make sure that no matter what happened in the future, Leo would always have a financial safety net. But my grief made me blind, and my son Bradley used that blinding grief to completely isolate me. In the months following Shirley's funeral, Bradley and his wife Chloe stepped in and slowly pushed me to the margins of their lives. They told me I needed to rest. They told me I was too emotionally fragile to handle the stress of family gatherings. They slowly built an impenetrable wall around my grandson, while simultaneously presenting themselves to the world as perfect tragic martyrs. Chloe was a prominent choir director at a massive wealthy community church in their upscale suburb. Bradley was the handsome, successful investment broker. Together they played their roles to absolute perfection. They stood in front of their wealthy congregation, shedding perfectly timed tears about the heavy burden of raising a chronically ill child. They soaked up the sympathy, the casserole dinners, and the massive charitable donations from their wealthy friends. I sat alone in my small house, believing I was just a tired old grease monkey who was getting in their way. I thought they were just protecting me from the pain. I never once suspected that the perfect facade they were projecting to the community was actually a dark, suffocating prison built entirely on lies. Sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the cracked screen of that stolen phone, a terrifying realization began to form in my mind like a slow, gathering storm. I started connecting the timeline of events that I had been too heartbroken to notice before. When Shirley was alive, Leo was a perfectly healthy, vibrant child. He was always running through my backyard, chasing fireflies, and laughing so hard he would get the hiccups. He was a ball of pure golden energy, but the mysterious, devastating illness that was supposedly destroying his little body only started after Shirley passed away. It only started after that massive medical trust fund was officially locked and established. I remembered the exact wording of the legal documents Shirley had shown me. The trust was ironclad. It stipulated that the millions of dollars locked inside could only be accessed and distributed if the beneficiary required lifelong, highly specialized medical care. Shirley thought she was protecting him from greedy relatives by putting those strict conditions in place. She had absolutely no idea that she was accidentally putting a massive financial bounty on the head of her own innocent grandson. I felt a wave of nausea crash over me as I remembered the day Bradley sat in my living room crying those fake crocodile tears. He sat right on my worn-out sofa and looked me dead in the eye, telling me that the doctors had discovered a rare degenerative genetic nerve condition in Leo. He blamed genetics. He told me the illness was causing the sudden lethargy, the terrifying weight loss, and the violent hand tremors that I had witnessed firsthand. I had watched my energetic, bright-eyed grandson slowly turn into a pale, stumbling ghost of a child. It broke my heart all over again to see him suffer. I felt so completely useless and helpless that I fell right into Bradley's trap. When Bradley sighed heavily and mentioned how the out-of-pocket medical costs for Leo's experimental treatments were bankrupting them, I did not hesitate. I immediately went to the bank and arranged for my entire monthly mechanical pension to be directly transferred into Bradley's personal accounts. I gave them every last dollar I had earned with my blood and sweat simply because I thought I was helping to keep my grandson alive. I poured my life savings into their pockets out of pure, unconditional love. Now, looking at the blood Leo had left on my hallway floor, the truth slammed into me with the force of a runaway freight train. My son had weaponized my love. He had weaponized the tragic death of my wife and her final act of protection. The lethargy, the weight loss, the violent tremors. They were not symptoms of a rare genetic disease. They were the direct result of whatever poison Bradley and Chloe were forcing down that innocent boy's throat. They were intentionally making their own flesh and blood violently ill just to meet the legal requirements of a trust fund payout. The crushing guilt of my own gullibility evaporated in an instant. It was entirely replaced by a cold, calculated, and mechanical rage. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was no longer an old man who could be easily pushed aside and manipulated by smooth-talking lawyers and fake church tears. I was a man who had spent his entire life taking things apart to find the broken pieces and putting them back together stronger than before. They thought they could break an innocent child for cash and get away with it because they wore expensive suits and smiled for the cameras. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated a father who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I carefully wrapped the dry, cracked phone in a piece of soft cloth and slid it into the inner pocket of my heavy denim jacket. The storm outside continued to rage violently against the windows, but the storm inside my chest was far more dangerous. I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going to rip their flawless public facade to shreds, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single drop of blood they took from my grandson. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting cold shadows across my kitchen floor. I had not slept a single wink. I spent the entire night sitting in my worn-out leather recliner staring at the front door with a heavy iron wrench resting on my lap just in case my son decided to come back. My joints throbbed with a deep, familiar ache that came from 40 years of bending over diesel engines, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the sharp, agonizing knot twisting in my chest. I had the cracked cell phone wrapped securely in a plastic bag and hidden deep inside a hollow compartment behind my baseboards. I knew I needed to take it to my friend Bill as soon as humanly possible to know exactly what kind of nightmare my grandson was living in. I had just poured myself a hot cup of black coffee when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet house. It was not the frantic, desperate pounding from the night before. This was a steady, measured knock of someone who carried a badge. I set my coffee mug down on the counter and took a long, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I walked down the hallway and pulled open the heavy oak door. Standing on my front porch in the crisp morning air was a local county sheriff's deputy and a young man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. "Hank Harrison?" the young man asked in a flat, monotone voice. "Yes, that is me," I replied, keeping my hands visible and my posture entirely relaxed. I knew from decades of living in this world that you never give the authorities a reason to view you as a threat. "You have been served," the young man said, shoving the thick manila envelope directly into my chest. He immediately turned around and walked briskly down the driveway toward his parked sedan. The sheriff's deputy stayed behind, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. "Mr. Harrison," the deputy said with a serious expression, "I am legally obligated to inform you that an emergency temporary restraining order has been granted against you by a county judge. You are hereby ordered to cease all contact with your son, Bradley Harrison, his wife, Chloe, and your grandson, Leo. You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of their persons, their residence, or the child's school. If you violate this order, you will be immediately arrested and incarcerated. Do you understand these terms?" I stared at the young deputy, feeling a cold, heavy stone drop straight into the pit of my stomach. I nodded slowly. "I understand, officer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm, even though my blood was boiling. "I will not cause any trouble." The deputy gave me a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to his cruiser. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. I carried the thick manila envelope into the kitchen and sat down heavily at the table. My arthritic fingers were shaking as I tore open the seal and pulled out the stack of legal documents. I spread the crisp white pages across the wooden table and began to read the formal typed words. It was a masterpiece of absolute legal fiction. I could see the slick, slimy fingerprints of my daughter, in-laws, brother, all over every single paragraph. Trent had clearly stayed up all night, using his prominent status as a local real estate lawyer to bypass the normal bureaucratic waiting periods. He had called in favors from judges he played golf with to push this emergency order through the system before the sun even came up. The sheer audacity of the lies printed on those pages made me physically sick. According to the sworn affidavits signed by both Bradley and Chloe, I was a dangerously unstable man. They claimed that I was suffering from rapid early-onset dementia. They painted a heartbreaking picture of an old mechanic whose mind was failing him, causing him to suffer from violent, paranoid delusions. Chloe had written a tearful statement swearing under oath that I had shown up at their house in the middle of the storm, broken a window, and kidnapped my disabled grandson in a state of deep psychosis. Trent had carefully crafted the narrative to make me look like a tragic but terrifying threat. The documents claimed that I believed Leo was perfectly healthy and that I was actively trying to prevent the boy from receiving his life-saving medication. They used my 40 years of hard blue-collar work against me, claiming the decades of breathing diesel fumes had rotted my brain. They stated that holding me legally accountable would be a cruelty, but keeping me away from their family was an absolute medical necessity for the safety of their sick child. I read the words over and over again, my vision blurred with hot tears of pure outrage. They were utterly brilliant. They knew that if I went to the police and told them my son was hurting my grandson, no one would believe me. Trent had preemptively discredited me. He had built a flawless legal wall around Bradley and Chloe ensuring that any accusation I made would simply be written off as the tragic ramblings of a senile old man. By declaring me a physical threat and legally barring me from coming within 500 feet of Leo, they had completely cut off my ability to protect him. If I drove to their massive house to check on him, I would go to jail. If I showed up at his elementary school to make sure he was safe, I would be arrested. They had effectively locked me out of my grandson's life with a few strokes of a pen. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The reality of the situation settled over my shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. I was legally outgunned. I was dealing with wealthy, educated people who knew exactly how to manipulate the justice system to their advantage. They thought they had trapped me. They thought I would just sit in my old chair and accept defeat, because I was just a tired old man with greasy hands. But as I looked down at those lying legal papers, I felt an absolute iron resolve harden inside my chest. Trent might know how to write a slick legal contract, but I spent my entire life taking apart broken machines, diagnosing the hidden problems, and completely rebuilding them from the ground up. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to find the weak spot in a system. They had drawn the battle lines and told me I could not fight back directly, so I would not fight back directly. I would use the digital secrets locked inside that cracked phone to quietly and systematically dismantle their perfect, wealthy lives until there was absolutely nothing left but ash. I had barely finished reading through the sickening lies printed in that restraining order when the loud crunch of gravel outside my front window caught my attention. I looked up and saw that same sleek silver sports car from the night before pulling into my driveway. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still a heavy, bruised gray. The driver's side door opened, and Trent stepped out into the damp morning air. He was wearing a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He stepped carefully over the muddy puddles in my driveway, acting like his expensive leather shoes were too good to touch the dirt of a working-class neighborhood. He did not even bother to ring the doorbell. He just pounded on the heavy oak wood twice and pushed the door open, stepping right into my front hallway without an invitation. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked out to meet him. I kept my hands resting loosely at my sides, but my muscles were coiled tight. Trent stood there in my hallway, looking around my modest home, with a look of absolute disgust on his face. He sneered at the worn-out carpet and the faded floral wallpaper that my late wife Shirley had picked out over 30 years ago. He looked at me like I was nothing more than a piece of garbage that someone had carelessly tossed onto his pristine lawn. "I hope you read the paperwork thoroughly," Hank Trent said. His voice dripped with arrogant condescension. He did not call me Mr. Harrison. He used my first name to make me feel small. I spent all night drafting those documents. It would be a real shame if my hard work went unappreciated. I did not say a word. I just stared at him, letting him talk. When you deal with a narcissistic predator, the best thing you can do is let them show you exactly how dangerous they think they are. Trent took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The sickening smell of his strong, expensive cologne filled my small hallway. "You need to understand exactly how this is going to work from now on, Hank," he said, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Bradley and Chloe are the victims here. They are the loving, devoted parents of a severely disabled child. You are just a confused, sick old man whose mind is rapidly failing him. That is the story. That is the legal reality, and you are going to accept it." I kept my face completely blank. "What do you want, Trent?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "I want you to understand the consequences of crossing me," Trent replied with a wicked, gleeful smirk. He was enjoying this. He loved having power over someone he viewed as intellectually inferior. "If you try to contact the police again, Hank, if you make one single phone call to Child Protective Services, or if you take one step anywhere near my sister or that boy, I will absolutely destroy the rest of your miserable life." Trent began pacing back and forth across my hallway, waving his hands as he laid out his twisted legal trap. He told me that if I caused any more trouble, he would immediately file a petition in family court to have me declared legally incompetent. He said he had already spoken to a corrupt psychologist who was perfectly willing to testify that my supposed dementia made me a physical danger to myself and the public. "I will strip you of your autonomy," Hank Trent threatened, stopping right in front of me. "I will take control of your estate. I will seize this pathetic little house and sell it to the highest bidder to cover the incredibly expensive medical treatments your grandson desperately needs. And you know what will happen to you." He leaned in close. His breath smelled like expensive peppermint and black coffee. "I will have you locked away in a state-run nursing home. I am talking about one of those underfunded, miserable facilities where they tie you to a bed and forget to feed you. You will rot in a damp room with no visitors and absolutely zero legal rights. I will take everything from you, Hank. Every penny of your pension will go directly to Bradley. You will die alone in a dirty bed and nobody will even care." The sheer malice in his threat was breathtaking. He had planned every single detail. He knew exactly how to use the justice system as a weapon of mass destruction. He was waiting for me to explode. He wanted me to scream at him or throw a punch so he could instantly call the cops and set his evil plan into motion right there on the spot. But I knew I had a secret weapon. I had the cracked cell phone safely hidden behind the baseboards in my kitchen. If I fought him now, I would lose everything, including my ability to save Leo. I had to swallow my pride. I had to give this arrogant monster exactly what he wanted to see. So I broke. I intentionally let my broad shoulders slump forward. I let my chin drop toward my chest, making myself look incredibly small and defeated. I forced my hands to tremble slightly, and I looked down at the muddy floorboards. "Please, Trent," I whispered, making my voice sound weak and completely broken. "Please do not do that to me. I do not want any trouble. I am just a tired old man. I will not call the police. I will not go near the house. Just leave me alone. Please. I just want peace." Trent let out a loud, sharp bark of laughter. He actually clapped his hands together in absolute delight. He completely bought the performance. His ego was so massive that he never even considered the possibility that a retired diesel mechanic could outsmart a hotshot real estate lawyer. "That is what I thought," Old Man Trent sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket. "You just sit in your recliner and watch your television. Leave the important family matters to the adults. If you behave yourself, we might even let you send Leo a Christmas card." Trent turned around and walked out the front door. He did not bother to close it behind him. I stood in the hallway and watched him stride confidently down my driveway. He slid into his silver sports car, revved the engine loudly, and sped off down the street, completely convinced that he had permanently checkmated me. I walked forward and quietly pushed the heavy oak door shut. I locked the deadbolt. As the sound of his engine faded into the distance, the fake trembling in my hands instantly stopped. I rolled my shoulders back, standing up to my full height. Trent was an arrogant, educated fool. He thought his expensive degree and his legal threats made him invincible, but he had made the most dangerous mistake a man can make. He walked into my garage and insulted my tools. He did not realize that I spent 40 years listening to engines. When a diesel motor is running dirty, burning black oil and destroying its own internal parts, it always sounds loud and powerful right before it completely breaks down. Trent and Bradley were running dirty. They were loud and arrogant. But a master mechanic knows exactly which bolts to unscrew to make the entire machine tear itself apart from the inside out. And I was about to dismantle their perfect lives piece by piece. I waited until the sun was fully up, and the neighborhood was wide awake before I finally made my move. I carefully retrieved the shattered smartphone from the hollow space behind my kitchen baseboards, where I had hidden it the night before. I wrapped the device tightly in a soft, clean shop rag, and placed it deep inside the inner pocket of my heavy denim work jacket. Trent and Bradley had effectively cut off my access to all the local authorities with that ridiculous emergency restraining order. With Trent actively playing golf with local county judges and manipulating the police force, I knew that taking this damaged phone to the local precinct would be a catastrophic mistake. They would simply confiscate the device, hand it right back to Chloe, and probably arrest me for theft on the spot. I needed someone completely outside of their poisonous circle of influence. I needed someone who knew exactly how to extract hidden digital secrets without leaving a single electronic trace. I got into my old reliable pickup truck and drove 30 miles out of the wealthy suburbs, heading deep into the rural county limits. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I constantly checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see my son's black SUV tailing me. I was heading to see a man named Bill. Bill and I went way back to a time long before my hair turned gray and my joints started aching with arthritis. He was a highly skilled retired police forensic technician who had spent over 30 years pulling deleted text messages and hidden financial files off encrypted hard drives for the state authorities. More importantly, Bill owed me a massive favor. Decades ago, when we were both young men struggling hard to make ends meet. Bill's transmission blew out on his work truck in the middle of a brutal Pennsylvania winter. He did not have a dime to his name to fix it, and he was days away from losing his job and his house. I spent 3 freezing nights in my drafty garage pulling that heavy transmission apart and completely rebuilding it for free so he could keep food on the table for his wife and kids. Bill never forgot that sacrifice. He was the kind of old-school blue-collar man who believed that a debt of honor was a lifelong binding contract. I pulled up to Bill's isolated log cabin and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. When he opened it and saw the grim, exhausted expression etched deep into my face, he did not ask any pointless questions. He took one look at me and immediately ushered me down the narrow wooden stairs into his basement. Bill's basement looked like the control room of a high-tech spaceship mixed with a dusty old mechanic's garage. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with heavy metal shelves packed tightly with circuit boards, tangles of fiber optic wires, and glowing computer towers. I sat down heavily on a metal work stool and pulled the shattered phone from my jacket pocket. I handed it to him and explained exactly what had happened during the torrential storm the night before. I told him about Leo showing up barefoot, bleeding, and terrified in the freezing rain. I told him about the emergency restraining order and the sickening threats Trent had made right in my own hallway just hours ago. Bill listened to me in absolute dead silence. His square jaw tightened, and his eyes grew dark with a quiet, simmering anger. When I finished my story, he simply nodded his head, took the cracked phone, and walked over to his massive primary workstation. He plugged the damaged Apple device into a thick, black metal box that was hardwired directly into his main computer monitor. He tapped a few keys, and a stark, solid red message popped up on the center of the screen, indicating that the phone was locked tight behind a complex 6-digit numerical passcode. "Do not worry about that screen," Hank, Bill muttered, keeping his eyes locked intensely on the glowing monitor. These wealthy suburban types always think their digital locks are completely impenetrable, but every single lock has a back door if you have the right heavy-duty keys. Bill booted up an old piece of restricted police decryption software he had kept from his active days on the force. He explained that the program would systematically bombard the phone's security firewall with thousands of passcode combinations every single second until it forced the digital deadbolt to snap open. I sat there, in the dim blue light of the basement, listening to the loud humming of the computer cooling fans and the steady rhythmic clicking of Bill's mechanical keyboard. Every passing minute felt like a grueling, suffocating hour. I had the patience of a mechanic used to waiting for penetrating oil to loosen a rusted bolt, but my nerves were completely frayed. My mind kept flashing back to the sheer unadulterated terror in Leo's hollowed-out eyes when he begged me not to let them take him back. I rubbed my calloused hands together, praying silently to Shirley that the damaged internal hard drive had not been completely destroyed by the heavy rain. Suddenly, a loud, sharp beep echoed from the computer speakers. The harsh red lock screen on the monitor flashed a bright, vibrant green, and the internal contents of the phone populated rapidly across the large digital display. "We are in," Bill announced, leaning forward in his desk chair. "The glass screen is shattered to hell, but the motherboard inside is perfectly intact. Now let us see exactly what your daughter-in-law was trying so desperately to hide from the world." Bill began expertly navigating through the phone's internal storage files. At first glance, it just looked like a normal everyday device filled with mundane grocery lists and schedules for church choir practices. But Bill was a seasoned professional who knew exactly where guilty people hid their dirty laundry. He completely bypassed the main photo gallery and dug straight into the deeply buried files of Chloe's cloud backup storage system. He located a hidden locked folder that had been protected by a secondary password, which his heavy-duty software easily bypassed in seconds. A massive grid of dozens of video thumbnails and extensive text message logs flooded the bright computer screen. The dates on the files stretched back for months. Bill slowly moved his mouse and clicked on the very first video file in the top row. The video player opened, expanding to fill the monitor, and began to run. As the horrifying visual images and the chilling audio filled that quiet basement room, the last remaining shreds of my broken heart completely shattered. All the confusion and the nagging, painful questions I had about my grandson's sudden, terrifying illness were answered in a matter of a few brief seconds. What I saw on that glowing computer screen made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. It was an evil so pure and calculated that it completely defied human logic. The first video file flickered to life on the large computer monitor, filling the dark basement with a bright, pale light. The hidden camera angle was slightly tilted, indicating that the phone had been propped up secretly on a kitchen shelf. The screen showed Bradley and Chloe's pristine marble kitchen. Chloe was standing at the large center island. She was dressed perfectly in her Sunday church clothes, with her hair pinned up completely immaculate and put together. But what she was doing with her hands made my breathing stop entirely. She was holding a heavy metal pill crusher. Sitting right next to her on the expensive countertop were 3 different prescription bottles. Bill expertly paused the video and used his software to zoom in and enhance the grainy image. The labels on the bottles became crystal clear. They were heavy, unprescribed adult sedatives and powerful muscle relaxers. Bill hit play again. I watched in absolute frozen horror as my daughter-in-law took several large white pills from the bottles and dropped them into the metal crusher. Her face was completely blank and chillingly calm. There was no hesitation or remorse in her eyes. She ground the heavy narcotics down into a fine, bitter powder. She then opened a small plastic cup of cinnamon applesauce and dumped the toxic white powder directly inside. She took a silver spoon and stirred the mixture seamlessly until the drugs were completely hidden. I could hear her muttering under her breath, complaining about how annoying this daily routine was. Then she looked up toward the hallway and called out to my grandson in a sickeningly sweet, fake voice, telling him it was time for his special afternoon snack. My grandson walked into the camera frame a few seconds later. He looked so incredibly pale and exhausted. He trusted his mother completely. He took the plastic cup and ate the poisoned food right in front of the hidden lens. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I felt a violent wave of physical nausea rise deep in the back of my throat. I had to grip the heavy metal edge of Bill's workbench just to keep my aging body from collapsing onto the concrete floor. For months, I had watched my beautiful grandson slowly waste away. I had watched his tiny hands tremble and his bright, energetic eyes turn dull and lifeless. I had cried myself to sleep countless nights believing that a cruel twist of genetics was slowly killing the boy I loved more than life itself. But it was not genetics. It was his own mother. Bill did not say a single word. He just kept his eyes glued to the screen, clicking through the files with a grim, heavy expression etched into his face. He closed the video player and opened a massive folder of recovered text messages between Chloe and Bradley. These were not the messages of worried, loving parents. They were the cold, calculated logistics of two ruthless monsters managing a sick, twisted project. I leaned in close to the glowing monitor and read the words my own son had typed. The text thread was dated 2 weeks before the night Leo ran to my house. Bradley had texted Chloe asking if the boy was ready for an upcoming home visit. A county social worker was scheduled to come to their house to verify Leo's declining physical state. Chloe texted back a long string of angry complaints. She actually complained to my son that Leo was not acting sick enough for the social worker visit. She wrote that he had entirely too much energy that morning, and it would completely ruin their narrative if the inspector saw him walking around normally. Bradley texted back immediately, telling her to double the dosage of the muscle relaxers. He explicitly ordered his wife to make sure the boy could barely hold his own head up when the state inspector finally arrived. They were intentionally poisoning an innocent 9-year-old boy. They were purposely feeding him a toxic daily cocktail of heavy adult narcotics designed to artificially simulate the exact physical symptoms of a fatal degenerative disease. I realized I was looking at a textbook horrifying case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. But as I read further through their sickening private conversations, I realized something even more sinister. Most cases of that psychological disorder are driven by a sick, twisted need for sympathy and community attention. Chloe certainly loved the endless attention she received at our local church. She absolutely loved playing the weeping, tragic mother in front of her wealthy choir members. But the public sympathy was just a highly convenient byproduct. The true motivation behind poisoning my grandson was driven by pure, unadulterated financial greed. Every single time they took Leo to a new medical specialist, they aggressively demanded more documentation of his severe physical decline. They used those heavily manipulated medical records as concrete proof of his supposed condition. I read another text message from Bradley, bitterly complaining that the private doctors were asking way too many questions, and they needed to switch pediatricians again. They were intentionally bouncing from hospital to hospital, keeping the medical professionals completely in the dark. They were using the terrible symptoms they created to get the exact terminal diagnosis they desperately wanted. My son was using his own flesh and blood as a disposable human prop. It took a few long, agonizing moments for my old brain to fully process the sheer magnitude of the personal betrayal. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had eagerly drained from my own retirement pension to give to Bradley. He had looked me right in my eyes and told me he was struggling to pay for experimental treatments to save my grandson's life. He had hugged me and thanked me for my sacrifice, while his wife was in the very next room crushing heavy sedatives into a child's applesauce. The profound grief that had consumed my life since my wife Shirley passed away had been completely and systematically weaponized by my own family. I looked away from the computer monitor and stared blankly at the dark concrete wall of Bill's basement. The heartbreaking image of Leo shivering on my porch, bleeding and begging for his life, flashed vividly through my mind. He knew. My smart, brave little grandson had somehow figured out that the food his mother gave him was making him sick. That is exactly why he stole the old phone and hid the camera to record her. He was actively looking for proof. He was trying to save his own life when absolutely no one else would listen to him. And when Bradley and Chloe realized he had taken the device, they hunted him through a freezing storm like a wild animal. Bill quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. His firm grip was full of silent, unwavering solidarity. He asked me what I wanted to do with the recovered files. I told him to copy every single video, every text message, and every single photograph onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I told him we were going to need every ounce of this digital evidence to tear their perfect, wealthy lives straight down to the very foundation. My son and his wife thought they had completely outsmarted a foolish old diesel mechanic, but they had absolutely no idea that I was about to use their own arrogant words to lock them behind cold iron bars for the rest of their miserable lives. Bill sat back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes, while the reality of what we just watched settled over us like a suffocating blanket. The videos of my daughter-in-law poisoning my sweet, innocent grandson were enough to lock her away for a very long time. But my old friend was thorough. He knew that in cases like this, the authorities always look for a concrete motive. People do not just wake up one day and decide to systematically torture their own flesh and blood without a reason. Bill told me that we needed to follow the money. He opened up a different folder on his computer screen. This one was filled to the brim with recovered emails and digital financial ledgers that Chloe had synced to her phone. As we started reading through the long chains of recovered emails, the true depth of their depravity began to unfold right in front of my eyes. This was not just a case of twisted psychological abuse. It was a massive and highly coordinated financial crime. The emails were a three-way correspondence between my son Bradley, his wife Chloe, and her arrogant lawyer brother Trent. I felt my stomach churn as I read their cold, calculating words. They spoke about my grandson as if he were nothing more than a profitable business asset. They referred to his horrific physical suffering as simple, necessary steps in their financial timeline. They were not worried about his failing health. They were only worried about meeting deadlines and filing paperwork. I stared at the screen as Bill clicked on an email sent directly from Trent to my son. Trent was the legal mastermind behind this entire nightmare. The email contained attachments of highly detailed, official-looking medical reports, but these were not real documents from legitimate doctors. Trent had used his legal connections and his office resources to completely fabricate them. He had created fake clinic letterheads and forged the signatures of prominent pediatric neurologists. The documents claimed that Leo was suffering from a rapidly progressing terminal nerve disease that required experimental and incredibly expensive lifelong care. Trent wrote in the email that these specific forgeries were exactly what they needed to satisfy the strict legal requirements of my late wife Shirley's medical trust fund. Shirley had worked so incredibly hard before she passed away to make sure that trust fund was secure. She put millions of dollars into that account with the sole intention of protecting Leo from any future hardships. The only way that money could ever be touched was if Leo faced a catastrophic medical emergency. She thought she was building a permanent safety net for the little boy she loved more than anything in the world. Instead, she had unknowingly created a massive financial prize for a group of greedy monsters. Trent had manipulated the legal system using his forged documents to convince the trust administrators that Leo was dying. He essentially unlocked the vault and gave Bradley and Chloe the keys to millions of dollars. Bill opened another file that showed the banking records and the outflow of all that stolen money. I expected to see at least some of it going toward medical bills or hospital visits to keep up their charade, but there was absolutely nothing. Not a single penny of Shirley's hard-earned money was ever spent on my grandson's care. The bank statements painted a crystal-clear picture of pure, unadulterated greed. There were massive wire transfers to offshore investment accounts managed by Bradley. There were exorbitant charges for luxury vacations to Europe that they took while leaving Leo with temporary caregivers. Chloe had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on high-end designer jewelry, expensive tailored clothing, and private spa memberships. And Trent did not do all of this illegal work out of the goodness of his heart. The digital ledgers showed regular monthly transfers going directly from the trust fund into a dummy corporate account that Trent controlled. He was taking a massive percentage of the stolen money as his personal fee for forging the medical records and keeping the legal authorities completely in the dark. He was getting rich off the physical torture of his own nephew. I remembered how he stood in my hallway just a few hours ago, looking down his nose at my modest home and my dirty work boots. He thought he was so much smarter than me. He thought his expensive suit and his smooth legal threats made him invincible. The deepest horror of their plan suddenly hit me with the force of a physical blow. The emails discussed a final timeline. They had a specific date in mind. Trent warned them that they could only keep the charade going for another few months before the trust administrators would demand an independent physical evaluation of Leo. Bradley replied that they would not need a few months. He coldly stated that Leo's body was already giving out from the heavy sedatives and the deliberate starvation. They were planning to let my grandson die. Once Leo passed away, the terms of the trust dictated that the remaining balance would default entirely to his parents. They were going to kill him, collect the rest of the millions, and walk away as wealthy, grieving parents. I felt a tear slide down my weathered cheek. It was not a tear of grief. It was a tear of absolute burning rage. My own son had traded his soul for a pile of money. He had looked at the beautiful, bright-eyed boy he brought into this world and decided that a luxury lifestyle was worth more than his son's life. He had watched Leo cry out in pain and confusion as the drugs ravaged his small body, and he had simply checked his bank balance to watch the numbers grow. He had used my pension money to fund his everyday expenses while he waited for the massive trust fund to pay out. Bill continued to navigate through the complex digital folders that Chloe had so carelessly synced to her cloud account. As we dug deeper into the financial records, the true nature of Trent and his involvement became chillingly clear. Trent was not just helping his sister and brother-in-law out of some twisted sense of family loyalty. He was a shadow accomplice who was actively bleeding my late wife Shirley's trust fund dry. The bank statements we found hidden in a locked folder showed a steady stream of massive automated transfers. Every single month, exactly 30% of the medical trust payouts were being funneled directly into a private corporate account. The account was registered under a dummy corporation that Trent completely controlled. He labeled these massive deposits as legal retainer fees to hide the stolen money from any potential tax audits or federal investigators. My stomach twisted with a sickening disgust. That greedy, arrogant lawyer was getting incredibly wealthy off the literal poisoning of his own nephew. He had stood on my porch in his expensive tailored suit, looking down on me while his pockets were lined with money that was supposed to protect my innocent grandson. But the financial horror did not stop with Trent. Bill opened another set of spreadsheets that exposed exactly what my son Bradley was doing with the remaining 70% of the trust money. I had always thought Bradley was a wildly successful investment broker. He drove luxury cars and wore custom clothes and constantly bragged about his massive client portfolios. The digital ledgers told a completely different story. Bradley was an absolute fraud. He had suffered catastrophic losses at his investment firm and was currently drowning in massive hidden debts. To cover up his massive financial failures, he was systematically draining Shirley's trust fund. He was taking the money that was legally meant for Leo's medical care and funneling it directly into untraceable offshore shell companies. He used those hidden accounts to artificially inflate his firm's numbers and to fund a lavish lifestyle he could not actually afford. My son was stealing millions of dollars from a dying child just to keep up the fake appearance of being a wealthy, successful man. He was a pathetic coward, hiding behind a fragile facade of stolen money and broken promises. Every single luxury vacation, every expensive piece of designer jewelry, every fancy dinner they bragged about to their wealthy church congregation was paid for with blood money. I read through endless receipts and credit card statements that proved their entire existence was a sickening lie. They were draining the trust fund at an alarming speed. The millions of dollars Shirley had carefully saved over a lifetime of hard work were vanishing into thin air. Bradley and Chloe were treating that medical trust like a bottomless personal cash machine. I felt a cold, heavy stone drop into the pit of my stomach as I realized the terrifying implications of their reckless spending. The trust fund was not infinite. At the rate they were burning through the cash, it would be completely empty within a matter of years. And once the money was gone, Leo would no longer serve any financial purpose to them. He would just be a sick, traumatized child standing in the way of their selfish desires. I stared at the glowing computer screen, feeling my breathing turn shallow and ragged. Bill clicked on one final text message thread between Bradley and Chloe that confirmed my absolute worst fears. They were actively discussing their exit strategy. Chloe complained that Leo's physical condition was becoming too difficult to manage at home. She said he was crying too much and asking too many questions about his medication. Bradley replied with a chillingly calm text. He told his wife to just be patient until the trust was fully liquidated. He explicitly laid out his final plan for my grandson. Once the money was completely gone, Bradley planned to use the fake medical records Trent had forged to have Leo permanently institutionalized. They were going to lock a perfectly sane, healthy boy inside a state-run psychiatric ward for the rest of his life. They wanted to drug him into a permanent stupor so he could never speak the truth about what they had done to him. They were going to throw him away like a broken toy and walk away without a single shred of remorse. They planned to completely erase him from the world just to protect their horrific secret and keep their stolen wealth completely secure. Sitting in that dark basement, reading the cold, calculated words of my own son, something inside me fundamentally fractured. The profound grief that had weighed me down since Shirley died completely evaporated. The desperate, panicked urge to simply rescue my grandson was no longer enough. Rescuing Leo would only solve half the problem. If I just took Leo away, Bradley and Chloe would simply twist the narrative, play the victims, and find a way to destroy someone else. The sheer astronomical scale of their betrayal demanded a much heavier price. I felt a deep, terrifying calm wash over my tired, aging body. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing slowed down to a steady, silent rhythm. I looked at Bill, and he saw the absolute dead certainty in my eyes. I was no longer just a grandfather trying to save a little boy. I was a man who was about to wage a total scorched earth war. I was going to strip them of their money, their freedom, and their pristine public reputations. My mission had shifted from a simple rescue to the absolute and utter annihilation of my son's entire existence. I was going to make sure they paid for everything they did. I asked Bill to print out all of those damning financial documents and place them into a secure physical binder. I wanted to hold the concrete evidence of their horrific crimes in my own hands. I drove back from Bill's cabin with the thick leather binder on my passenger seat and the encrypted flash drive tucked safely inside my shirt pocket. The sky was turning a bruised purple as I pulled into my driveway and parked my old truck. My mind was focused on the impending war. I had a mountain of irrefutable evidence, including bank statements, forged medical documents, and the horrifying videos of Chloe poisoning my grandson. But I also knew my son, Bradley. He was a cornered rat who had built his life on a fragile house of cards. Cornered rats are incredibly dangerous. While I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the printed pages, my old landline began to ring. I walked over and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. Bradley was on the other end. He did not sound like the polished, wealthy investment broker anymore. He sounded breathless, frantic, and completely unhinged. The arrogant facade had melted away, leaving raw, desperate panic. He demanded to know where the old cell phone was. He realized Leo had taken it during his desperate escape into the storm, and he knew the phone had to be sitting somewhere inside my house. "Listen to me, you crazy old fool!" Bradley spat through the phone line, his voice trembling with a venomous rage. "I know the boy brought it to your house. I know you have it. You need to hand it over right now. If you even try to turn it on, I will ruin you. I will have Trent bury you in so many lawsuits you will die in a cardboard box on the street." I stayed perfectly calm. I let his empty threats wash right over me. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I told him I was just a senile old man, legally barred from coming within 500 feet of his family, so he had no reason to call me. Bradley screamed a vile curse and slammed the phone down. The loud dial tone buzzed in my ear. He was terrified. He knew exactly what was on that device. If I took that phone to the police, his entire life would be over. He would lose the millions of dollars, the luxury cars, the massive house, and his prestigious reputation. He would trade his expensive, tailored suits for a bright orange prison jumpsuit. Because of that terrifying reality, I knew Bradley was going to take desperate, violent measures to get that evidence back. I walked through the dark rooms, pulling the heavy curtains shut and locking every single window. I dragged an oak chair and wedged it under the brass knob of the back patio door. I was an old diesel mechanic who knew how to secure my perimeter. I took the encrypted flash drive and the leather binder full of financial documents and sealed them inside a waterproof metal ammunition box. I carried the box down into my basement and locked it securely inside my old floor safe. If Bradley wanted to silence me, he was going to have to do a lot more than wave a piece of paper. I walked back upstairs and went straight to my hall closet. I pulled out a solid steel crowbar that weighed a good 10 pounds. It was cold and heavy in my calloused hands. I carried it into the living room and sat down in my leather recliner facing the front window. I sat in the pitch-black silence, listening to the wind rattle the old wooden frames. I knew my son would never do his own dirty work. It was a little past 2 in the morning when the quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken. I heard the low, stealthy rumble of a heavy engine rolling slowly down my street. A dark vehicle pulled up to the curb, cutting its headlights, before gliding to a stop right in front of my driveway. I peered through a small gap in the living room curtains. 2 massive figures stepped out of the dark vehicle, dressed entirely in black clothing, with dark ski masks pulled down over their faces. These were professional hired thugs. Bradley had opened his wallet and paid these violent men to break into my home disguised as a random late-night home invasion. Their mission was incredibly simple. They were sent here to tear my house apart until they found that cracked cell phone, and they were ordered to beat a stubborn old mechanic into complete submission. I watched them walk up my front pathway, carrying heavy metal pry bars. They completely bypassed the front door and moved silently toward the side window of my kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I did not feel an ounce of fear. The initial shock of my son's betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind nothing but a cold, hardened determination. I stood up from my recliner and gripped the heavy steel crowbar tightly in my right hand. I listened as the men jammed their tools into the wooden frame of my kitchen window. I heard the sickening crack of splintering wood and the sharp shatter of breaking glass. They thought they were breaking into the home of a weak, frightened senior citizen who would simply cower in his bed and beg for mercy. They thought this was going to be an easy paycheck, but they had absolutely no idea what kind of man was waiting for them in the dark. The sound of shattering glass tore through the quiet night like a gunshot. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows of my hallway. My breathing was slow and measured. Decades of working in loud diesel shops taught me to focus entirely on the task. I heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the linoleum floor of my kitchen. The two intruders had climbed through the broken window. They were moving clumsily. They knocked over a stack of metal pots I had deliberately left near the counter as an early warning system. They thought they were hunting a confused, frail senior citizen who would simply hide under his bed covers and cry for help. They expected a remarkably easy job. They brought bright tactical flashlights and heavy steel pry bars, but they brought an enormous amount of arrogant stupidity right along with them. I knew every single creak and groan of these old floorboards. I built half of this house with my own bare, calloused hands decades ago. The darkness was my absolute advantage. I gripped the solid steel wrench tightly in my right hand. The cold, heavy metal felt like a natural extension of my own arm. I stepped back into the pitch-black corner of the living room, waiting patiently for the first beam of light to sweep past my hidden position. The larger of the two men stepped through the kitchen doorway first. His flashlight beam cut randomly across my faded floral wallpaper. He grunted softly to his partner, telling him to go check the back bedrooms for the old man. His partner turned away, leaving the large man completely exposed in the narrow hallway. He took 2 confident steps forward directly into my striking range. He never even saw me move from the dark shadows. I did not swing wildly like a frightened, helpless victim. I swung the heavy steel wrench with the calculated precision of a veteran mechanic striking a seized engine block. The thick, solid metal collided violently with the side of his right knee. A sickening hollow crack echoed down the hallway. The massive man let out a sudden, ragged scream as his leg completely buckled beneath his heavy weight. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, dropping his flashlight and his pry bar. Before he could even try to recover, I stepped out of the shadows and brought the heavy wrench down hard across his shoulder. He gasped and went entirely limp on the floor, gasping for air in pure agony. The absolute shock radiating from his masked face was palpable in the dim light. He realized instantly that he had walked blindly into a vicious tactical trap. His partner heard the loud commotion and came sprinting back down the hallway from the dark bedrooms. He rounded the corner, gripping his heavy crowbar with both hands ready to swing at whatever was attacking his friend. The bright beam of his flashlight hit my face, illuminating my cold, steady expression. I stood tall over his fallen friend, holding the steel wrench ready for the next strike. He froze for a fraction of a second. That tiny moment of hesitation was all I needed to turn the tables. I kicked the dropped flashlight hard across the floor, blinding him momentarily, as the intense light spun wildly around the room. I lunged forward, driving my solid shoulder directly into his chest. My 40 years of lifting heavy steel beams and massive transmission blocks gave me a raw physical strength he completely underestimated. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing backward into the wooden door of my garage. His metal crowbar clattered loudly onto the floorboards, sliding completely out of his reach. I grabbed him by the thick, durable fabric of his dark jacket and slammed him fiercely against the solid wood frame of the door. I pressed the cold, heavy head of my wrench directly against his throat, trapping him firmly against the wall. My eyes locked onto his through the jagged holes in his dark ski mask. He was breathing in rapid, shallow bursts. The violent arrogance was completely gone from his eyes, replaced entirely by raw, suffocating terror. "You are going to tell me exactly who sent you here." I said, keeping my voice low and terrifyingly calm. The man swallowed hard, struggling to take a full breath against the heavy steel pressing into his neck. He tried to stammer out a weak lie, claiming they were just random burglars looking for quick cash. I pushed the heavy wrench a fraction of an inch deeper, cutting off his air supply just enough to let him know I was not playing a game. "I am not a stupid man," I told him quietly, leaning closer to his face. "I know my son sent you here tonight. Now you will tell me exactly what Bradley told you to do, or I will make sure you cannot walk out of this house under your own power." The sheer, unadulterated panic completely broke his resolve. He started talking so incredibly fast, the words spilled out in a pathetic, desperate rush. He confessed everything without any hesitation. He told me that a wealthy man named Bradley had paid them $10,000 in raw, untraceable cash. He told me Bradley handed them a highly detailed layout of my home and explicitly ordered them to retrieve an old, cracked cell phone hidden inside the property. My blood ran freezing cold as the trembling thug revealed the final terrifying part of their sick arrangement. Bradley had strictly instructed them to beat me severely enough to guarantee I ended up in the intensive care unit. My own son had paid a small fortune to have me brutally destroyed just to cover up his monstrous crimes against my grandson. The magnitude of that vile betrayal solidified my resolve to utterly annihilate his existence. I stared down at the trembling man, knowing the time for any mercy was completely over. I kept the heavy steel wrench pressed firmly against the intruder's throat until his panicked breathing turned into weak, pitiful gasps. I pulled my own cell phone from my pocket and hit the record button, making sure the audio was picking up every single word spilling from his terrified mouth. I made him repeat the entire sickening arrangement from start to finish. I made him state his full name and the name of the man who hired him. He cried like a broken child as he confessed that Bradley Harrison had paid him $10,000 in untraceable cash to break into my home, steal a cracked phone, and beat me until I was confined to a hospital bed. Once I had the entire confession saved securely on my device, I pulled a roll of thick industrial zip ties from my kitchen drawer. I bound his hands and feet tightly together, leaving him completely immobilized on my hardwood floor. I dragged his groaning partner out of the hallway and zip-tied him right next to his friend. They were not going anywhere. I stepped over their bodies and walked into my kitchen to grab the waterproof metal ammunition box from the floor safe. My first instinct was to pick up the phone and dial the local emergency dispatch number. I wanted to see those two thugs dragged out of my house in heavy metal handcuffs. I wanted to see police cruisers swarming Bradley's massive luxury estate before the sun even came up. But I stopped myself before my finger even touched the keypad. I remembered the smug, arrogant smirk on Trent's face when he stood in my hallway hours earlier. Trent was a slick, prominent real estate lawyer who spent his weekends playing golf with county judges and buying expensive dinners for the local police captains. If I called the local precinct, Trent would know about it before the dispatch operator even hung up the phone. He would pull his corrupt strings, and the officers would simply confiscate the cracked cell phone as evidence. That broken device was the only thing keeping my grandson alive. If Trent got his slimy hands on it, the evidence would conveniently disappear into a locked evidence room forever. I would be thrown into a jail cell for assaulting two men, and Bradley would walk away completely scot-free. I needed a much bigger hammer. I quickly grabbed my old truck keys and dialed Bill's number as I walked out the back door. Bill answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake and ready for war. I told him briefly about the home invasion and the recorded confession. I told him we needed to bypass the local authorities entirely and take our mountain of evidence to people who could not be bought by a small-town real estate lawyer. Bill completely agreed. He told me to meet him at an abandoned diner halfway between our towns. I threw my heavy denim jacket over my shoulders, grabbed the metal box containing the financial ledgers, the encrypted flash drive, and the cracked phone, and locked my house up tight. I left the two hired thugs squirming on my kitchen floor. The local police could deal with them whenever my neighbors finally noticed the broken window. Right now, my only mission was protecting Leo. I climbed into my old reliable pickup truck and fired up the diesel engine. The loud rumble of his motor felt like a battle cry in the quiet night air. I threw it into gear and sped away from my neighborhood. I met Bill at the deserted diner, just as the sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised gray. He climbed into the passenger seat of my truck, carrying a thick briefcase filled with his own forensic reports. He had stayed up all night organizing the digital evidence into a bulletproof timeline of horrific abuse and massive financial fraud. We did not exchange any pleasantries. We both knew exactly what was at stake. We pulled out onto the interstate and headed straight for the regional FBI field office in Pittsburgh. The drive took 2 agonizing hours, but neither of us spoke a single word. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my arthritic knuckles ached, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me sharply focused. I thought about the millions of dollars Bradley and Chloe had stolen from my late wife. I thought about the heavy, unprescribed sedatives they had crushed into my grandson's food. Every mile marker we passed fueled the cold, burning rage inside my chest. They had used my grief to isolate me, and they had used my pension to fund their fake lives. I was bringing a federal storm right to their front door. We pulled into the massive parking lot of the federal building just as the morning commuter traffic was starting to thicken. The towering glass and concrete structure looked incredibly intimidating, but I did not feel an ounce of fear. I grabbed the metal box from the back seat and walked through the heavy glass doors with Bill right by my side. We stepped up to the main security checkpoint and placed our items on the metal counter. The armed guard looked at my worn-out work boots and my faded flannel shirt with a hint of skepticism. I looked him dead in the eye and kept my voice dangerously calm. I told him my name and demanded to speak directly with a senior federal agent who handled massive corporate wire fraud and severe child endangerment. I slid the thick leather binder of forged medical documents and offshore banking transfers across the counter. I told him I had a recorded confession of a hired hit and undeniable proof of a multi-million-dollar extortion ring. The guard took one single look at the very top page of Bill's incredibly detailed forensic report, and his entire professional demeanor immediately shifted. The heavy steel trap was finally sprung. We sat together in a sterile, windowless room deep inside the massive federal building. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on the metal table. Across from Bill and me sat 2 seasoned FBI agents. Lead Agent Thomas Harris was a broad-shouldered man with sharp, intelligent eyes. His partner, Agent Davis, possessed the same intense, focused demeanor. I watched their faces closely as they reviewed the contents of our metal box. They started with the financial ledgers and forged medical documents Trent had arrogantly created. Agent Harris flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with every newly uncovered shell company and offshore wire transfer. When Bill pulled up the video file on his laptop and hit play, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally shifted. The 2 veteran agents who had likely seen the absolute worst of human nature went completely rigid. They watched in horrifying silence as my daughter-in-law crushed heavy narcotics and fed them to my pale, exhausted grandson. Agent Harris slowly closed the laptop screen. He took a deep breath and looked directly into my eyes. His expression was a mixture of profound disgust and unwavering respect. He told me that in his 25 years of federal service, he had rarely seen a case of such pure malice. He confirmed exactly what Bill and I already knew. This was no longer just a local matter of child abuse or simple embezzlement. Because Trent and Bradley were funneling Shirley's trust fund money across state lines and routing it through international offshore accounts, they had triggered massive federal jurisdiction. They were looking at conspiracy to commit wire fraud interstate bank fraud, and severe child endangerment charges. Agent Harris explained that the fabricated medical documents alone carried enough weight to send Trent to a federal penitentiary for decades. The sheer scale of the financial deception elevated this to a massive racketeering case. They were bleeding a trust dry while torturing a 9-year-old boy. Agent Davis chimed in, pointing out a critical detail in the financial spreadsheets Bill had recovered. Bradley and Trent were moving fast. The ledgers indicated that they were preparing to execute one final massive wire transfer at the very end of the month. They were planning to completely liquidate the remaining balance of Shirley's trust fund and move the money into a series of untraceable shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Once that money vanished across international borders, recovering it would become a bureaucratic nightmare. The agents had more than enough evidence to raid their properties right now, but Agent Harris wanted an airtight, undeniable case. He wanted to catch them dead to rights. He wanted to secure a rock-solid conviction that not even the most expensive defense attorneys could ever dismantle. To do that, the FBI needed to catch Bradley and Trent actively conspiring and admitting to the final transfer before the money disappeared. They needed a live, recorded confession of their entire grand criminal scheme on tape. Agent Harris leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He told me that Bradley was getting desperate and careless because of the missing cell phone. That desperation was our greatest weapon. He explained that Bradley was hosting a massive charity gala at his luxury estate that coming weekend. It was an event designed to publicly parade my grandson around to gather sympathy and solicit even more donations from their wealthy church congregation. Agent Harris proposed a daring and dangerous sting operation. The FBI wanted to wire me for sound and send me directly into the lion's den. They wanted me to attend that high society gala uninvited and corner my son and his arrogant lawyer brother-in-law. The goal was to use their own panic against them, to dangle the missing cell phone like a piece of raw meat and goad them into openly admitting their plans for the final trust transfer. It was a massive, dangerous risk, but it was the only way to lock them behind iron bars permanently. I did not even hesitate for a single second. I looked at the two federal agents and told them to strap the wires to my chest. I had spent 40 years of my life building structural foundations with heavy steel and honest sweat. I knew how to stand my ground against unbearable pressure. My son thought he could discard his own flesh and blood for a luxury lifestyle. He thought his expensive suits and his offshore accounts made him an untouchable titan. He thought his old diesel mechanic father was nothing but a foolish stepping stone. He was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the strength of a grandfather protecting his family. I told Agent Harris that I would walk right through the front doors of that pristine mansion and tear their perfect, wealthy facade straight down to the studs. I would look my son directly in his eyes and make him confess his depravity while the federal government listened to every word. Bill placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder as the agents began to lay out the tactical logistics. They promised me that a fully armed federal strike team would be stationed completely out of sight surrounding the perimeter of Bradley's estate. They would monitor my audio feed in real time, ready to breach the heavy oak doors the absolute second I gave the verbal signal. They gave me a detailed briefing on how to guide the conversation, how to push Trent's arrogant buttons, and how to exploit Bradley's fragile ego. I listened carefully, absorbing every single instruction with cold, calculated precision. The grief that had crippled me for months was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, burning justice. I was going to wear that hidden microphone like a suit of armor. I was going to march into that den of vipers and let them dig their own graves with their arrogant tongues. The trap was officially set, and the bait was ready. The grand ballroom of the Grand Crest Hotel looked like a palace bathed in gold. I stood near the massive double doors watching the wealthy elite of our city glide across the polished marble floors. The sheer scale of the extravagance made my stomach churn with a violent, sickening disgust. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a bright, pristine light over tables covered in crisp white linen and expensive floral arrangements. Waiters in sharp black tuxedos floated through the crowded room carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. It was a scene ripped straight out of a billionaire lifestyle magazine. But I knew the dark, horrifying truth hiding beneath the sparkling surface. This entire high-profile charity gala was built on the physical suffering and slow poisoning of my innocent 9-year-old grandson. Bradley and Chloe were hosting this massive event under the guise of raising awareness for Leo's rare terminal condition. In reality, it was the absolute pinnacle of their sick, twisted financial charade. I kept to the shadows near the back of the room, wearing a borrowed suit that felt tight and unnatural over my broad shoulders. Underneath my crisp white shirt, the cold, heavy tape of the federal wire pressed tightly against my chest. Every breath I took was a sharp reminder that the federal agents were sitting in an unmarked surveillance van outside, listening to every single rustle and murmur. I scanned the crowded ballroom and saw the absolute worst kind of hypocrisy playing out in real time. Bradley and Chloe were working the room with the practiced ease of professional con artists. Chloe wore a stunning black designer gown that probably cost more than my old diesel truck. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a tragic, brave smile that completely fooled everyone around her. She held a crystal glass of champagne in one hand, while she gently dabbed away fake tears with the other. I watched in quiet, burning rage as she spoke to the wealthy members of our local church congregation. These were good, honest people who had brought casseroles to their house and offered endless prayers for my grandson. They were completely captivated by Chloe's performance. They pulled out their checkbooks and wrote massive donations, believing they were funding experimental treatments to save a dying child. Bradley was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by local politicians and wealthy private investors. He looked incredibly handsome and polished in his tailored midnight blue suit. He shook hands and patted backs, projecting the image of a strong, wealthy father desperately fighting to save his only son. He smoothly guided the conversation toward the massive, silent auction table set up along the back wall. He was actively bleeding these people dry, using his own child as a disposable prop to gather endless waves of untraceable cash. Massive, professionally printed banners hung from the high walls displaying blown-up photographs of Leo. The pictures showed my sweet grandson, looking incredibly pale and exhausted, sitting in a wheelchair with dark, heavy circles under his eyes. They had intentionally drugged him into a stupor just to capture those heartbreaking images. Seeing his beautiful face plastered across those glossy banners made my hands curl into tight, heavy fists. They were monetizing his pain. They were using the terrible symptoms they had artificially created to solicit hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single night. All of this money was supposed to go toward a fake medical foundation Trent had set up. But I knew every single penny would simply be funneled right back into their offshore shell companies to fund their lavish vacations and cover Bradley's massive investment debts. The gentle clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass echoed through the massive ballroom. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd slowly faded into an expectant silence. The bright overhead lights dimmed down, and a single bright spotlight illuminated the main stage at the front of the room. I felt a cold rush of pure adrenaline pump through my veins as Trent confidently walked up the carpeted steps and approached the wooden podium. He was the keynote speaker for the evening. He looked out over the crowd with a smug, arrogant smile, adjusting the microphone with his perfectly manicured hands. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. He was the legal mastermind behind this entire nightmare, and now he was standing in the spotlight, basking in the unearned respect of the entire city. Trent cleared his throat and began to speak in a smooth, practiced baritone voice. He thanked the politicians and the church leaders for their incredible generosity and their unwavering support during this devastating family crisis. He spoke about the heavy burden of childhood illness and the heartbreaking reality of watching a bright young boy slowly slip away. His words were so perfectly crafted and delivered with such calculated emotion that several women in the front row actually began to weep. I stood in the back of the room listening to the man who forged medical documents and took a 30% cut of my grandson's trust fund talk about the sacred bonds of family. He praised Bradley and Chloe, calling them the strongest, most resilient parents he had ever known. He talked about their endless sacrifices and their unwavering dedication to providing Leo with the best possible care. It was a masterclass in pure psychological manipulation. He was standing in front of hundreds of prominent people painting his criminal accomplices as absolute saints. The sheer magnitude of their deception was almost difficult to comprehend. They had built a perfect, impenetrable fortress of lies. They truly believed they were completely untouchable. They believed they could poison a child, steal millions of dollars from a dead woman's trust fund, and parade their fake grief in front of the entire city without facing a single consequence. I stood there ready to absolutely destroy their fake kingdom of stolen wealth. I was legally banned from stepping foot anywhere near this hotel. Bradley and Trent had made absolutely sure of that when they filed their fraudulent restraining order against me months ago. If any local police officer saw my face in that grand ballroom, I would be arrested on the spot, and their sick charade would continue. But those arrogant men severely underestimated what a father will do to protect his blood. They also forgot that an old diesel mechanic knows exactly how the hidden gears of a massive machine actually turn. The wealthy elites in their expensive, tailored suits only ever see the shiny front doors and the polished marble lobbies. They never pay attention to the service entrances, the loading docks, or the narrow concrete hallways where the real work gets done. I parked my old truck 3 blocks away in a dark alley. I slipped out of my jacket and pulled on a crisp white button-down shirt and a black vest. Bill had managed to borrow a spare uniform from a friend who managed a local catering company. It was slightly tight across my broad shoulders, but it was the perfect urban camouflage. To the wealthy elite, a man wearing a catering vest pushing a metal cart is completely invisible. Beneath the crisp white fabric of that borrowed shirt, the heavy federal wire was taped tightly against my bare chest. The cold metal transmitter felt like a block of ice against my skin, but it grounded me. I adjusted the small hidden earpiece tucked deep inside my left ear. Agent Harris spoke to me in a low, steady voice directly from the unmarked surveillance van parked out on the street. He told me the federal strike team was in position and waiting for my signal. They had eyes on all the exterior exits and were monitoring the local police frequencies to make sure Trent did not try to pull any last-minute favors. I whispered a quick confirmation into the microphone hidden beneath my collar. I walked down the dark, sloping concrete ramp leading into the underground loading dock of the Grand Crest Hotel. The air down there smelled like exhaust fumes and damp cardboard. It was an environment I knew intimately. I grabbed an empty silver utility cart sitting near the delivery bay and began pushing it purposefully toward the heavy metal service doors. You have to walk like you completely belong there. 2 private security guards were stationed right inside the loading dock entrance. They were young kids in cheap suits, leaning against a cinder block wall, looking at their phones. My heart hammered a heavy rhythm against my ribs, but I kept my face entirely blank. I pushed the rattling silver cart straight toward them without slowing down. I gave them a tired, exhausted nod, like a man who had been working on his feet for 12 hours straight. They barely even glanced in my direction. They simply stepped aside and let me push the metal cart right past them and into the bustling service corridor. The back hallways of the hotel were a chaotic maze of rushing waiters, shouting chefs, and clattering dishes. I kept my head down and navigated the narrow concrete corridors with the steady precision of an old mechanic tracing a complex fuel line. Agent Harris guided me through my earpiece, using the hotel blueprints his team had pulled from the city archives. "Take the next left and look for service elevator 4, he murmured in my ear. I turned the corner and found the heavy steel doors of the service elevator exactly where he said it would be. I pushed my cart inside the empty elevator and pressed the button for the mezzanine level. The old hydraulic motors groaned as the metal box slowly began to ascend. I closed my eyes for a brief second and thought about my sweet grandson, Leo. I pictured his pale, exhausted face and his trembling little hands. I thought about the heavy, unprescribed sedatives Chloe had mixed into his applesauce while she complained about the inconvenience of it all. I thought about Bradley funneling Shirley's hard-earned trust fund money into offshore accounts to pay for his fake luxury lifestyle. That pure, blinding anger washed over me again, completely burning away any lingering traces of fear or hesitation. The elevator jolted to a stop, and the heavy doors slid open. I stepped out into a dark, carpeted hallway, situated high above the main event space. I left the utility cart in the corridor and walked quietly down the narrow passage. The loud, booming sound of Trent delivering his hypocritical keynote speech echoed through the walls. I was moving directly above the grand ballroom, creeping along the hidden spine of the building like a silent ghost. Agent Harris told me I was exactly 50 feet away from the main target. I reached a thick black door marked Authorized Personnel Only. It was the primary audio-visual control room. The federal agents knew this room would be completely empty because the hotel sound engineers were all stationed down on the main floor managing the live event. I gripped the brass handle and pushed the door open, slipping inside the dark, quiet space. The room was incredibly small and packed with towering racks of electronic equipment glowing with hundreds of tiny blinking lights. A massive wall of thick, soundproof glass stretched across the front of the room, providing a perfect, unobstructed view of the glittering ballroom below. I stood in the dark, staring down at the hundreds of wealthy donors in their expensive clothes. I could clearly see Bradley and Chloe sitting at the main table pretending to be tragic, grieving parents. They were surrounded by local politicians and prominent community leaders who were completely blind to the monstrous evil sitting right in front of them. I tapped my hidden microphone and whispered to Agent Harris that I was in position and ready to trigger the trap. I stood in the dark control room, looking down through the thick, soundproof glass at the glittering ballroom below. The air in my lungs felt hot and heavy, but my mind was completely clear. Down on the main floor, the lavish charity gala was reaching its grand finale. The soft, ambient music faded out, and the master of ceremonies called my son Bradley up to the main stage. The wealthy attendees fell silent. The glittering crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft, warm glow. I watched Bradley walk up the carpeted steps with a microphone in his hand. He looked like the absolute picture of a perfect, devastated father. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a meticulously practiced expression of deep sorrow. But what truly made my blood boil was who he was carrying in his arms. Bradley was holding my 9-year-old grandson, Leo. The sight of that sweet, innocent boy made my chest physically ache. Leo looked incredibly pale and frail. His head rested weakly against Bradley's shoulder, and his eyes were barely open. He was heavily sedated, just like they had planned. They had purposely pumped him full of those toxic muscle relaxers right before the event, so he would look like he was rapidly fading away. Bradley stepped up to the center of the stage and adjusted the microphone. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed a carefully curated slideshow of beautiful family photographs. Pictures of Leo from before the poisoning began mixed with tragic images of him in hospital beds. It was a perfectly calculated visual manipulation designed to extract maximum sympathy and massive checks from the local politicians and church members in the audience. I pressed the small earpiece deeper into my ear and listened to the audio feed piped directly into the control booth. Bradley's voice echoed through the massive speakers filling the grand ballroom with lies. He started talking about the unbearable pain of watching his only son suffer from a mystery illness. He actually managed to squeeze out a few fake tears. He wiped his eyes and talked about the enormous financial burden of experimental treatments and constant medical care. He looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and begged for their generous support to help save Leo's life. Chloe was standing right in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while Trent nodded solemnly beside her. It was the most disgusting display of pure evil I had ever witnessed in my entire 74 years of life. They were using a drugged child as a live prop to steal millions. I turned my back to the glass window and walked over to the heavy door of the control booth. I engaged the thick metal deadbolt and wedged a heavy wooden chair tightly under the handle, just like I had done at my own house. Nobody was coming inside to stop me. I moved over to the main audio-visual control board. It was a massive console covered in glowing buttons and complicated sliding switches. But to a man who had spent 4 decades rewiring complex industrial diesel engines, it was nothing more than a simple circuit board. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from my shirt pocket. Bill had prepared it perfectly. It contained the exact files we needed formatted to override any standard media player. I plugged the small metal drive into the primary master port of the projection computer. I tapped my hidden microphone and gave Agent Harris the final signal. I told him the bait was set and the trap was about to spring. I took a deep breath and placed my rough, calloused hands on the control panel. Down below, Bradley was reaching the emotional climax of his speech. He held Leo up slightly and asked the crowd to open their hearts and their wallets to help fund the newly established medical foundation. People in the audience were actually crying and reaching for their checkbooks. I gripped the main projection switch and slammed it forward. I bypassed the hotel's pre-programmed presentation and instantly seized total control of the massive screens and the main audio system. Down in the ballroom, the giant slideshow of happy family pictures abruptly went completely black. A loud burst of static hissed through the towering speakers, cutting Bradley off right in the middle of a fake sob. The crowd gasped in confusion. Bradley turned around and stared up at the blank screen, tapping his microphone and looking annoyed. He signaled for the audio-visual technicians to fix the glitch, but there was no glitch. A second later, the massive screens flickered back to life, blazing with a bright, undeniable clarity. But it was not a picture of a happy family anymore. It was the hidden camera video Leo had recorded in their pristine marble kitchen. The video filled the enormous screens, stretched out massive and crystal clear for every single wealthy donor politician and church leader to see. The entire ballroom watched in absolute frozen silence as a giant image of Chloe appeared on the stage. There she was in her Sunday church clothes, holding the heavy metal pill crusher. The resolution was perfect. The high-definition screens showed the labels on the prescription bottles of heavy adult sedatives. A collective gasp of sheer horror rippled through the audience as the video showed Chloe dumping the large white pills into the metal crusher. They watched her grind the heavy narcotics down into a fine, bitter powder. They watched her mix the toxic drugs directly into a small plastic cup of cinnamon applesauce. But I did not stop there. I reached over and pushed the master audio fader all the way to the maximum limit. Bill had expertly overlaid the horrific video with the recovered audio files we pulled from Trent's hidden corporate server. The booming voices of Trent and Bradley suddenly thundered through the ballroom speakers echoing off the crystal chandeliers. It was a recording of a phone call where the two men were laughing and celebrating. The wealthy audience listened in total stunned silence as Bradley's own voice bragged about doubling Leo's dosage to fake the symptoms for the state inspector. They heard Trent laughing and reminding Bradley to make sure the offshore shell companies were ready for the final massive wire transfer from Shirley's Medical Trust. The hypocrisy was instantly shattered into a million pieces. The undeniable reality of their monstrous crimes was echoing loudly across the entire hotel. Down on the stage, Bradley stood completely frozen. His fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared up at the massive screen, watching his own wife poison their son, while his own recorded voice proudly confessed to the massive financial fraud. The wealthy crowd sitting at the fancy tables completely erupted. People were shouting in shock and disgust. Several donors stood up and began pointing at the stage. Chloe dropped her crystal glass of champagne, and it shattered loudly against the marble floor. Trent spun around frantically looking for an exit, but the damage was already permanently done. I stood in the dark control room, looking down at the absolute destruction of their perfect wealthy lives, and I felt a deep, profound sense of justice settling into my old bones. The massive ballroom below me descended into a thick, suffocating silence. It was the kind of absolute quiet that only happens when hundreds of people collectively stop breathing. For 5 agonizing seconds, the wealthy attendees simply stared up at the giant digital screens in pure, unadulterated shock. They watched the horrifying high-definition footage of Chloe aggressively grinding heavy adult narcotics into a fine powder. They listened to the booming recorded audio of my own son Bradley laughing about manipulating his sick child to drain millions of dollars from a dead woman's trust fund. The sickening reality of what they were witnessing slowly sank into the minds of every politician, investor, and church leader in the room. They had been completely played. They had been manipulated into opening their checkbooks by a pair of ruthless monsters. Then the silence shattered. The room erupted into an absolute deafening roar of outrage. Chairs scraped violently against the polished marble floor as people jumped to their feet in utter disgust. Wealthy women in expensive gowns covered their mouths in horror, while prominent community leaders began shouting furiously toward the main stage. Down on that stage, the perfect, untouchable facade of the House of Harrison crumbled into a million worthless pieces. Bradley stood frozen under the bright spotlights with his mouth hanging open. The handsome, grieving father routine vanished in the blink of an eye. His face turned an ashen, sickly gray as sheer animal panic took over. He frantically handed my sedated grandson over to a bewildered event staffer and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed wildly up at the audio-visual booth and demanded that the hotel security immediately cut the feed. He yelled that it was a fake video, that it was all a complete misunderstanding. But his desperate lies were completely drowned out by his own recorded voice booming through the speakers. Down in the front row, Chloe finally realized that her pristine luxury lifestyle was completely over. The fake tears she had been dabbing away just moments ago were replaced by wide-eyed terror. She dropped her designer handbag, completely abandoned her husband, and lifted the hem of her expensive black gown. She turned and tried to sprint frantically toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom, pushing aggressively past the shocked donors who were blocking her path. She thought she could just slip away into the night and escape the consequences of torturing an innocent 9-year-old boy. But she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side of those heavy oak doors. That panicked sprint was the exact cue the federal agents had been waiting for. I pressed my hand against the glass window of the control booth and watched the beautiful trap snap entirely shut. The massive double doors at the back of the ballroom were suddenly kicked open with tremendous violent force. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents swarmed into the elegant space, wearing dark tactical gear with bright yellow letters across their chests. Agent Harris led the charge, barking loud authoritative orders that instantly silenced the chaotic crowd. It was a perfectly executed tactical breach. The wealthy attendees immediately backed away, clearing a wide path as the federal strike team flooded the room. 2 agents intercepted Chloe before she even made it halfway down the center aisle. They grabbed her by the arms, spun her around, and slammed her face first onto a crisp white linen table. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking around her delicate wrists echoed loudly over the commotion. She thrashed and screamed, crying real tears of panic as they read her rights in front of her entire high society network. Meanwhile, Agent Harris and 3 other officers stormed directly up the carpeted steps of the main stage. Bradley tried to back away, raising his hands in a pathetic surrender, but he had absolutely nowhere left to run. They grabbed my son, threw him roughly against the wooden podium, and locked him in cold iron chains. I watched from high above as the arrogant investment broker and his cruel wife were publicly humiliated, stripped of their power, and paraded out of the ballroom like common street criminals. I did not wait to watch Trent get arrested. My job in the control booth was officially done. I turned away from the thick glass window and sprinted out the heavy black door. I ran down the narrow concrete service hallway as fast as my old aching knees could carry me. I found the concrete service stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time, ignoring the sharp burning pain in my chest. I pushed my way through the heavy swinging doors at the bottom and burst out into the chaotic perimeter of the grand ballroom. The room was a mess of flashing blue lights, shouting federal agents and shocked wealthy donors scrambling toward the exits. I ignored all of it. My eyes swept frantically across the massive room until I found exactly what I was looking for. A young federal agent was kneeling near the edge of the stage, gently holding Leo in her arms. I pushed my way forcefully through the dense crowd of people shouting that I was the grandfather. The agent looked up, saw the absolute desperation in my eyes, and stepped aside. I dropped to my knees on the hard marble floor and pulled my sweet grandson tightly into my chest. He was trembling uncontrollably, and his skin felt as cold as ice. He was completely bewildered by the shouting and the flashing lights, barely able to keep his eyes open due to the heavy sedatives coursing through his tiny veins. I wrapped my arms around his frail body, burying my face in his soft hair. I told him over and over again that he was safe now. I promised him that nobody would ever hurt him or give him bad medicine ever again. He weakly lifted his little arms and hugged my neck, burying his face against my shoulder. I felt his hot tears soaking into the fabric of my borrowed catering shirt. I held him with all the fierce protective strength a 74-year-old diesel mechanic could muster. A team of emergency paramedics rushed through the crowd carrying a stretcher and heavy medical bags ready to detox his small body and undo the damage his mother had caused. I refused to let him go as they loaded him onto the stretcher, climbing right into the back of the ambulance with him. We had won the war, and I was never going to leave his side again. Following the chaotic and highly publicized raid at the luxury hotel, the federal justice system moved with a terrifying and beautiful speed. The massive mountain of hard, digital evidence Bill and I handed over to Agent Harris was absolutely ironclad. Bradley, Chloe, and Trent were immediately denied bail, They spent the months leading up to their trial sitting in cold concrete cells, stripped of their tailored suits and designer gowns. Their expensive defense attorneys tried every trick in the book to suppress the hidden camera footage and the recovered financial ledgers, but they were fighting a losing battle against the United States government. The FBI had the wiretap recordings, the offshore banking trails, and the physical medical reports proving my grandson had been systematically poisoned for profit. Long before the criminal trial even began, the family court system moved rapidly to completely strip Bradley and Chloe of all their parental rights. I sat in the family courtroom, holding Leo's small, trembling hand, while the judge signed the permanent custody order, giving me full legal guardianship of my brave grandson, Bradley. And Chloe were not even allowed to be in the same room as us. They lost their son forever. When the federal criminal trial finally commenced, it was a total massacre. The prosecutors laid out the entire sickening timeline for the jury. They showed how Trent fabricated the terminal diagnosis. They showed how Chloe ground up the heavy sedatives. They showed how Bradley funneled the stolen trust fund money into dummy corporations to cover his massive investment debts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on every single charge. The day of the sentencing arrived with a heavy, somber atmosphere in the federal courthouse. I sat in the front row wearing my best suit. With my hand resting quietly on Bill's shoulder, I watched the bailiffs lead my son and his wife into the courtroom. They looked incredibly small and pathetic in their standard orange prison jumpsuits. The arrogant glow of their high society lifestyle had completely vanished. Their skin was pale and their eyes were cast downward. Trent was brought in right behind them, looking entirely defeated. The slick, untouchable real estate lawyer had been officially disbarred and absolutely ruined. The Internal Revenue Service had already swooped in and seized every single one of his luxury assets, his cars, his properties, and his hidden bank accounts to cover the massive fines and back taxes he owed. He was left with absolutely nothing to his name. The federal judge presiding over the case was a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience on the bench. When she read the sentencing, she did not hold back a single ounce of her utter disgust. She looked directly down at Bradley and Chloe and told them that in her entire career she had never witnessed such a vile and calculated betrayal of a child. She stated clearly, for the official record, that their insatiable financial greed had completely stripped them of their basic human humanity. She told them they were monsters who had weaponized a dying grandmother's love to torture an innocent 9-year-old boy. Her sharp words echoed through the silent courtroom, sealing their dark legacy forever. She sentenced Bradley and Chloe to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison for severe child endangerment conspiracy and massive wire fraud. They would serve every single day of that sentence without any possibility of early parole. Then the judge turned her furious gaze toward Trent. She strongly condemned his disgusting abuse of the legal system and his total lack of moral character. She handed him a rigid 12-year federal prison sentence for his role as the shadow accomplice who orchestrated the elaborate financial deception as the bailiffs moved in to escort the three of them away to begin their long, miserable lives behind bars. Bradley stopped and looked back at me. There was no apology in his hollow eyes. There was only the broken realization that he had completely destroyed his own life. I did not blink. I did not look away. I stared right back at him with the cold, steady gaze of a father who had done exactly what he had to do. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them, and I felt a massive, suffocating weight finally lift off my tired old shoulders. The aftermath of the trial brought a deep, profound sense of closure to our lives. The federal investigators worked tirelessly to trace and recover the stolen money from Bradley's offshore shell companies and Trent's hidden dummy accounts. It took several months of incredibly complex legal maneuvering, but the authorities managed to seize and return every single stolen penny. My late wife Shirley's multi-million-dollar trust fund was completely restored and fully secured in a heavily protected account. The money was placed under the strict supervision of an independent court, appointed financial fiduciary, ensuring that it could never be touched by greedy hands ever again. That money would be there to guarantee that my grandson would have the brightest, safest, and most secure future possible. Shirley had worked her entire life to provide a protective safety net for the boy she adored, and I had successfully defended her beautiful legacy. I walked out of that federal courthouse and breathed in the crisp, clean morning air. For the first time in an incredibly long time, the world felt perfectly right. The dark storm of deception and cruelty that had threatened to swallow my family had been entirely vanquished forever. The arrogant villains who truly thought they were completely untouchable were now locked away in cold iron cages where they could never hurt another innocent living soul again. I slowly walked over to my old, trusty diesel truck and climbed into the driver's seat, feeling a deep, peaceful satisfaction settling deep into my weary bones. My long, exhausting mission to completely destroy their kingdom of lies was finally accomplished. 6 months have quietly passed since the day the federal agents dragged Bradley and Chloe out of that glittering hotel ballroom in heavy iron handcuffs. 6 months have passed since the heavy steel doors of the justice system slammed shut on the absolute worst chapter of our entire lives. The terrible nightmare is officially and permanently over. A few weeks ago, the family court judge signed the final decree granting me full and permanent legal custody of my grandson. I remember holding that thick stack of legal papers in my calloused hands and crying tears of pure, profound relief. It was the absolute ultimate guarantee from the government that Leo would never have to look over his shoulder in fear ever again. The immediate aftermath of the federal raid was incredibly difficult, but it was also a beautiful journey of profound physical and emotional healing. The most miraculous transformation of all happened right before my very eyes. Once the hospital doctors completely flushed that toxic, sickening cocktail of unprescribed sedatives and heavy adult muscle relaxers out of his tiny system, a truly beautiful thing happened. The supposed rare degenerative condition that Bradley and Chloe used to solicit donations and drain Shirley's massive trust fund simply vanished into thin air. There was no mystery childhood illness. There was no failing heart or weakening muscles. It was all a complete, sickening fabrication born entirely from their deep, insatiable greed. Watching my sweet grandson wake up from that terrible drug-induced fog was exactly like watching the bright, warm sun rise after a long, brutal winter. The dark, heavy circles under his eyes faded away completely. The pale, sickly gray tone of his skin was quickly replaced by a healthy, vibrant, rosy glow. He started eating real, solid meals again, instead of poisoned applesauce. He started smiling and laughing out loud with a joy that fills my entire house with light. Today, Leo is exactly what he was always meant to be. He is a normal, energetic, and incredibly happy 9-year-old boy. He runs through my backyard with endless, boundless energy, chasing the neighbor dogs and climbing the thick branches of the old oak trees. Our weekends are entirely sacred now. We spend our Saturday mornings out in my dusty garage, surrounded by the familiar, comforting smells of motor oil and old heavy grease. I bought an old broken-down pickup truck just for the two of us to rebuild together, piece by piece. I stand there in my worn-out denim overalls and pass him heavy steel wrenches. He leans over the greasy cast-iron engine block with dark oil smeared across his smiling face, asking me 100 questions a minute about spark plugs and fuel injectors. He loves learning how things work and how to fix things that are broken. When I look at him holding that heavy wrench, I do not see the broken, terrified child sitting alone in a dark kitchen. I see a strong, resilient young boy who survived the absolute worst of human nature and came out shining brighter than ever before. Looking back on this entire agonizing ordeal has taught me a very profound lesson about the true meaning of family. We are often raised to believe that blood is the strongest bond in the entire world. We are told that family will always protect you, no matter what the circumstances might be. But the harsh, painful reality is that blood means absolutely nothing if it is completely poisoned by greed and selfishness. My own son traded his flesh and blood for offshore bank accounts and expensive luxury cars. I learned that real family is not just about sharing a last name or sharing genetics. Real family is about the people who are willing to stand up and fight the terrifying monsters lurking in the dark for you. It is about the people who will risk their own safety and their own freedom to keep you completely safe from harm. I spent 40 long years working as a heavy diesel mechanic, believing that justice was something the universe naturally handed out to good, honest people. But I learned the hardest way possible that justice is not simply handed out by fate or destiny. Sometimes when the system fails, and the wealthy villains truly think they are completely untouchable, you have to pick up a heavy steel wrench and build that justice yourself. You have to tear down their lies and construct a fortress of truth to protect the innocent people you love. I look at Leo wiping grease from his forehead and laughing at a joke I just made, and my heart swells with a peace I have not felt since my beloved Shirley passed away. We survived the storm. We defeated the monsters. We reclaimed our lives and our future. The road ahead of us is filled with new possibilities, and we will walk it together side by side. I wake up every single morning filled with overwhelming gratitude for this incredible second chance, knowing that my grandson's life is finally safe and completely his own. The dark shadows of deceit are gone forever, and the morning sun shines down warmly on our peaceful, humble little home. We have successfully rebuilt a solid foundation of pure, unshakable trust, replacing the endless sorrow with genuine laughter and profound hope. Every evening when we sit quietly together on the front wooden porch, listening to the gentle wind blowing through the pine trees, I know we finally won our precious freedom back. If my story made your blood boil and your heart cheer for justice, please hit that like button to support a grandfather who refused to back down. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth conquering evil. And let me know down in the comments, what city are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Your support means the world to families fighting in the dark. Thank you, and God bless.